So now we're going to talk about a different aspect of the family. Now we're going to look at how children have changed over time and what their place in the family has meant and what it means now. So first, the first thing you have to understand is that the idea of childhood is a relatively new invention. In fact, in the earlier aspects of human history, children were just viewed as being much smaller, less capable adults. You can see this in these Renaissance paintings. For instance, look at the one of the father with his son and daughter. His son is probably 11 or 12 years old. His daughter is probably 5 or 6, yet they are drawn proportionally to look like they're adults, but on a smaller scale. The same can be seen with both of the paintings of the sisters. They are drawn with the proportions of an adult, but the scale of a child. You can also see that here in this picture of the children, the siblings. The oldest daughter looks like she might possibly be the mother. The littlest child looks much older than what she actually probably is. Something else that's changed is the idea of naming a child. Before the 1800s, children typically didn't live to see 2 to 3 years old. So they would wait until the child was older than, say, 5 before they actually gave it a name. And if the child died before, its second, third, fourth birthday, they would name it Baby and then the family's last name. So you can see Baby Monster, and we can't make out what the last name in the other one is. In those rare cases where they did name the child prior to turning 5, if that child died, its sibling may end up with the same name. So that you may see a family that had 3 John Smiths, for instance, but 2 of them had died as infants, so the third one just carries on the same name. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever seen the movie Mary Poppins, but for those of you who have, Mary Poppins, one of the main characters played by Dick Van Dyke, is a chimney sweep, and he plays this very carefree, very happy person who cleans out chimneys. However, the reality is that people that look like Van Dyke weren't the people who were actually cleaning chimneys. So you can see here in this photo is a adult male getting onto a child for not wanting to clean the chimney. You see, chimney sweeps by and large were small children aged 3 to 5 because an adult couldn't fit into the chimney, and even these small children would sometimes get stuck and would die. So here's yet another photo of chimney sweeps. You can see how excited and happy they look to be doing their job. The reality of it is, though, is that these children were often orphans, so that no one would miss them if they did die, because as I said in the previous slide, inevitably several would die in the chimneys where they would get stuck, or someone would still be using the chimney while they were cleaning it and they would burn to death. It's pretty tragic, pretty horrible. When the Industrial Revolution hit, children were also put to work there. So children found jobs in factories. This was often very dangerous work. They would be asked to climb inside of the different machines to pull things out of the gears that got stuck. But inevitably, there would be a child who would get crushed in those gears or would lose limbs. Fires were very prevalent in those different types of factory jobs, and those children would burn to death. Here's yet another picture of some factory work. You can also see some coal mining type work where they're pulling a cart of tools through one of the mines. It's too small for an adult to fit through, so they have the child crawl through it. Again, this is extremely dangerous work. These children on average were like less than the age of 6. Here's another picture of a child working. You can see shoe shine. That's probably the safest job someone could have had at this time period. But eventually things changed. So in this photo you see Shirley Temple, her husband, and their baby. Now, for those of you who know who Shirley Temple was, she was an actress. She was in the movie Annie, the original. I think it came out in the 1930s. Now, this was not the norm to see pictures like this. This is something that we start seeing where people decide that it's time that children experience a childhood and that they should be protected. So child labor laws were passed, which kind of created this sentiment. Now, This started all around between World War One and World War II is where you see the majority of this happening. Now, it had started happening in the more elite individuals' lives, probably a little bit earlier than that. But really, for the majority of people, it's this time period between World War One and World War II that you really see this like gaining ground and becoming a popular sentiment across all groups of people. The reason for that is that after World War One and the loss of life, you start seeing people coming together and deciding that they want to live their lives their way. Women especially decided that they were not just going to have children for the purposes of taking care of farms or whatever, and that they wanted to lead their own lives. You see the first women's rights movement during that period where they gained the right to vote. And divorce starts to rise, becomes very, very salient during this time period. Then the Great Depression happens and people are forced to be together. And so divorce falls, families stay together even if they might not have. World War II comes about, a lot of people die. And so when the soldiers return from World War II, everybody's just super happy to be alive and they decide to get married. And this is where the baby boomer generation comes from. And these children are spoiled. So you can see this in this picture. They take these baby pictures, and you might not think this is weird because we do this today, but this wasn't something that was done previous to this. So children are starting to have playtime. Whereas before they would be working during these hours, now they're going to school and then they get to play. So you can see the kids with the archery practice and the marbles. You start seeing toys being marketed to children. So they're now trying to sell things for children to buy. This was probably World War II. The doll Raggedy Ann and Andy starts to become very popular among children. The Bugs Bunny cartoons begin to come out. Now, during the 1930s, Bugs Bunny was not aimed at children. This is something that a lot of people probably don't know either. That Bugs Bunny and all of these animated cartoons actually preceded movies in the movie theaters. And it was the same as us watching trailers now. You would watch these cartoons while they set up the movie. Well, they often had very adult humor. But then children saw the brightly animated cartoons, and thus the idea of children being associated with cartoons is born because they start marketing things to children using the cartoons. Now, as children are now being considered these unique, precious lives, we also start to see the way that they're dressed is now becoming changed. But there's no gendering at this point. Today, when you think of like how boys and girls should dress, they're often dressed very differently. There's often very brightly colored clothes associated with each gender, with blues being typically associated today with boys and pinks being associated with girls. This was not always the case. So as you can see in this picture, if you look at the one on the left, there's a mother holding her son. She has another son and a daughter standing beside her. I dare anyone to try and guess which is which. In the picture on the right, you can see a little brother and his older sister. They are dressed the exact same way. Now, I don't know the colors of those outfits, but I would be willing to bet that they are matching colors as well. And then we have this glorious young person here. Now, this person, before I tell you who it is, I'm curious. What would you think? Is this a boy or a girl? Give you a second to think about it. This is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, former president of the United States. He's dressed in a very pink outfit with what looks like a bonnet in one of the pictures and very nice sandals that he's wearing. And this would have been typical for someone of his status and age at the time period when this was taken. So one of the interesting things about this time period is that previous to the 1950s and 40s, the color pink was very much associated with boys, not with girls. And the reason for that is that pink dye is expensive, and therefore if they're going to use an expensive dye, it was most often used on their sons. This also purple is the same way. There are only two colors that have the word royal that precede them. One is purple, one is blue. Both of those colors were called that because they were the most expensive dyes to make. So therefore, they were only used on boys. Girls were often dressed in light blues because blues were very cheap to make, very easy dye to make. If we go back to the 1970s, 80s cartoon series He-Man, you can see that the main character in that wears pink and purple, Prince Adam. So Google it if you don't know who that is. It's a very interesting little cartoon from the 1980s. But it also shows how people define gender during those times. But this is kind of what we're used to today, right? Like we see the girls' toys in pink, blue, boys' toys in blue. Girls' toys typically now are dolls. Boys' toys are action figures, Legos, and things like that. This also wasn't always the case. So, for instance, in the case of dolls, both boys and girls played with dolls when they were little. And the reason for that is that the older siblings had to take care of the younger ones. So the dolls were a training tool. And it didn't matter if it was a boy or a girl, whoever was the oldest siblings had to take care of the younger ones because the parents had to work, right? So both of them played with dolls so that they could get used to caring for an infant, so that they could care for an infant until the next oldest child could take over, and then the older child could go out to work as well. In the case of Legos, let's take a look at this ad. If we take a look at the picture on the right, this is an ad from the 1970s, 80s, where a young girl is holding just a set of what we would recognize as regular Lego bricks. Now, the picture on the left is a more modern version of Legos where the young girl has these really pink and purple colored blocks. The blocks aren't shaped the same. The blocks come with instructions that are basically idiot proof. You can't mess up how the pieces fit together, and in some cases some of those pieces only fit together one way, whereas in the picture on the right the girl can make whatever she wants. She had, there were no instructions during the time period. The blocks are every single color. There are no pink blocks at all in those sets. And those sets would have been the ones that both boys and girls played with. The one on the left is marketed solely to young women.